Hey everyone, my name's Dani and this is my channel, Dani Gets Dark, where we deep dive into some really weird stuff, and tonight is no different. Just think of me as your late night horror hostess who loves the macabre. So if you're into that type of stuff, hit that subscribe button and grab some coffee. Let's get into it. Some books were written to preserve knowledge, but this one was written to weaponize it. In the late 1400s, the church was in crisis. I mean, the plague had just torn through Europe, superstition was at an all-time high, and people were desperate to make sense of their suffering. When crops failed or a child got sick, there had to be someone to blame. And for centuries, that blame had been pointed at women who didn't quite fit in. Midwives, healers, widows who had owned land, anyone on margins. Now guys, just to be clear, this is not a man-bashing or agenda-driven story. You have to remember, this was a time when fear, religion, and power mixed, and women just happened to be standing in the crosshairs. Now in 1487, a Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer decided to put all that fear into writing. He called his book Malleus Maleficarum. Oh my god, try saying that 4 times fast. That was incredibly hard to say. Or the simpler name, The Hammer of Witches. It claimed to explain who witches were, what they did, and how to destroy them. So let's start with the man himself, Heinrich Kramer. He wasn't high-ranking clergy. He actually wasn't even respected. Most people in his own order saw him as obsessive and unhinged. He'd spent years collecting evidence of witchcraft. Women who said the wrong thing, herbalists who treated illness without church permission, even weather patterns that he claimed were caused by spells. Then in 1485, Kramer was assigned to investigate witchcraft in Innsbruck, Austria. He turned it into a spectacle. He ordered mass arrest, interrogations, and what we would now call torture sessions, all without official sanction. Witnesses later said he became fixated on one woman in particular, a local noblewoman who had publicly mocked his sermons. Kramer accused her of witchcraft, of using her beauty to bewitch men. And it was less about religion and more about humiliation. Sounds like he got his ego a little bit hurt. Eventually, the Bishop of Innsbruck had enough. He declared the trials invalid and ordered Kramer out of town. For a man obsessed with authority, that was devastating. He lost his post, his credibility, and, most importantly, the church's support. But here's where the story takes a turn. Kramer didn't disappear. He decided to write the ultimate defense of his beliefs. A book that would prove him right, no matter how many people disagreed with him. In his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the last man brave enough to tell the truth. Kramer started writing The Hammer almost immediately after his expulsion. He worked alone, surrounded by scraps of old church decrees, quotes from the Bible, and hearsay from his earlier trials. He wanted to build something airtight, something no one could argue with. The first part of the book was proof that witchcraft existed. He used scripture, theology, and even philosophy to argue that witches were not only real, but common, that the devil was actively recruiting them to overthrow Christian order. The second part described what witches supposedly did. They raised storms, stealing men's reproductive organs, turned milk sour, you name it. If anything bad happened, the book had an explanation for it. And the third part, the worst one, gave step-by-step instructions for how to find, interrogate, and execute witches. And in this case, women. It instructed judges to accept the testimony of neighbors as fact. It said torture was acceptable, even necessary to force confessions. And if a woman denied being a witch, well, that was proof she was lying, because the devil supposedly made witches incapable of admitting guilt. Now you can see how impossible it was to survive once you were accused. It's the same logic as drowning test. If you sank, you were innocent but dead. If you floated, you were guilty and burned. Kramer didn't stop there. He sent the manuscript to the University of Cologne to be reviewed by theologians, but they rejected it. They said it was too extreme. It was too cruel and it had too many superstitions in there. So Kramer, he went higher. He claimed papal authority, including a papal bull called Summis Desiderentes Effectibus, issued 2 years earlier, that allowed inquisitors to prosecute witchcraft in Germany. Historians now believe he forged or exaggerated that endorsement, but at the time, it worked. The church's seal appeared in the printed edition, and that was all people needed to believe it was official. The witch's hammer hit the presses just as printing was revolutionizing Europe. Before that, books were copied by hand. Now they could reach hundreds of towns in months, and fear, once it's written down, spreads even faster than rumor. Within a decade, it was everywhere, in courts, universities, and pulpits. It turned superstition into law. It told men they were righteous for their violence, and it told women that no amount of innocence could save them. And if you think that's messed up, this is where the story shifts from disturbing to almost conspiratorial. When historians began comparing copies centuries later, they noticed quite a few differences. The early editions, the ones printed closest to 1487, included a section at the end about repenting. Kramer had written that a person accused of witchcraft who confessed and repented could find forgiveness through God. But in later versions, that section completely disappeared. Gone. Some of the earlier pages also includes a warning, a note to judges that confessions obtained through extreme torture might not be reliable. And that warning is missing in most surviving prints. It's tempting to think the pages were lost through age, but the evidence doesn't support that. In several libraries, curators found signs that the missing leaves had been cut out cleanly, not torn or crumbled. Someone physically removed them. But why? That's the mystery. One theory simply states that church authorities ordered revisions to eliminate any trace of hesitation. The witch hunts were ramping up by the 1500s, and the church wanted unity, not caution. A book that gave even a whisper of mercy undermined that. Another theory is that later printers did it themselves. So back in the day, printing was actually a really risky business. You could be executed for hearsay. If the Inquisition was cracking down on unapproved versions, a printer might remove questionable sections just to stay alive. And then there's the third theory, one that edges into folklore, that the missing pages contain something truly forbidden, rituals, counterspells, or accounts of women fighting back. There's no proof of that, that's why I said folklore, but it's a theory that keeps resurfacing in occult circles. Because let's be honest, what's more chilling than the idea that even the instructions for mercy were destroyed? It's easy to think this was just medieval hysteria, but this book didn't stay in the past. Its ideas traveled. They crossed borders, oceans, and eventually, centuries later, they helped spark the most famous witch hunt of all, the one in Salem. But that's a story for another video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Heinrich Kramer died in obscurity, but his ideas outlived him and began to move through Europe like a slow-burning fuse. It spread quietly among those who saw it as guidance. Even as the church tried to distance itself from his methods, it was too late. The logic had already taken root. Across Germany, France, Scotland, and England, people began to adapt his words to fit their own fears. Local magistrates who had never studied theology started quoting this book as if it were scripture. Judges used it as reasoning to justify mass interrogations and executions. Ordinary villagers, desperate for someone to blame when life turned cruel, they followed suit. Between the 1500s and the 1600s, tens of thousands of people, most of them women, were accused, tortured, and executed for witchcraft. And each generation seemed to add their own new layer to the madness. New manuals began popping up across Europe, all borrowing from the same foundation that Kramer had laid down. There was De Praestilegis Daemonum by Johann Weyer, which tried to temper the hysteria but ended up being used by both sides. A Discovery of Witches by Matthew Hopkins, not to be confused with the show. I actually had to double check because I was like, that's so cool. Is that based on the same thing? It's not. But Discovery of Witches is based on a book series, just not this one. Thank goodness. But A Discovery of Witches, the one I'm talking about right now, this served as a step-by-step hunting guide during England's witch trials. Perhaps the most influential of all, Daemonologie, written in 1597 by no other than King James of Scotland, who later became King James I of England. See, James wasn't just another scholar. He was a ruler who had personally participated in witch trials. He believed a coven of witches had plotted his death during a sea voyage and became so consumed by the idea that witchcraft was an active threat to his crown. When he wrote Daemonologie, he wasn't speculating. He was literally declaring war on what he thought was a real enemy. The book reinforced every major claim that the witch's hammer had made a century earlier. Satan worked through them, and eradicating them was a divine duty. But now, those same ideas carried the power of the crown. With a king's seal stamped onto centuries-old superstition, witch hunting no longer looked like paranoia. It looked like a policy. And policy has a way of traveling. When English settlers crossed the Atlantic to start their new lives in the American colonies, they brought their faith, the Bible, and their books, including, you guessed it, Daemonologie. The Puritans studied it closely. They quoted its passages. It shaped the laws they wrote, the sermons they preached, and the fears they passed down to their children. By the time the next great witch panic began, those same teachings had been woven so deeply into the culture that no one questioned where they came from. They simply accepted it as truth. And in a small Puritan village 2 centuries after Heinrich Kramer's death, the same fear that once swept through Europe would rise again. This time in Salem, Massachusetts. By the 18th century, witch trials were finally fading out. Science was starting to explain the things that superstition once claimed as proof of magic. Who would have guessed it? Disease had causes, and weather had patterns. And slowly, Europe began to see that most of what they had called witchcraft was nothing more than science. But the cultural scar never really healed. The same mechanisms, fear, moral panic, and control, kept finding new targets. They just changed names. In one century, it was witches. In another, it was heretics, or scientists, or political enemies. The pattern is always the same. People in power use fear to draw lines between us and them. If you strip away the Latin and the religious language, the hammer of witches isn't about sorcery. It's about how far people will go to defend their certainty. And that's why it still feels relevant now. We may not burn witches anymore, but we still burn reputations. We still silence people that we disagree with. We still turn superstition into entertainment. The tools may be different, but the instinct is the same. Now, when we talk about the Malleus Maleficarum today, it's easy to picture it as some rare mythical relic that sits locked in a dusty archive. And in a way, I mean, it's not far off, but there are only about 30 known copies left in the world. Most of them preserved under glass in university libraries or museum collections. The book itself feels haunted, not because of superstition, but because of what it represents. You can even find a few digitized versions online. Every surviving copy is a physical reminder of how easily an idea can outlive its author. Heinrich Kramer has been dead for more than 500 years, yet the system he built, the logic of suspicion, of fear disguised as justice, is still remembered through time. When scholars began studying the surviving texts more closely, they noticed something chilling. The book wasn't just a theological document. It was a manual of persuasion. It was designed to sound authoritative, to read like truth, even when it wasn't. Each line reinforces the one before it. The thing that stuck with me the most is the missing pages. We don't know who cut them or why. But the more time passes, the more those absences start to mean something on their own. Maybe those blank spaces are proof that people tried, even briefly, to slow this thing down. Maybe someone saw what was coming and tried to stop it, one torn page at a time. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe there were never any words of mercy at all, and we've just imagined them because we want to believe someone, somewhere, had second thoughts. Either way, it's still frightening. Okay, I really want you guys to think about this for a second. Do you think if Heinrich was alive today, he would see this as vindication? Or do you think he'd be horrified by what he created? And obviously, we'll never know, but I like to hear your theories on it. Thank you so much for watching. This is Dani reminding you that every story holds a hint of truth or a shadow of a legend. Until next time, stay curious and keep the lights on. Subscribe.